right, well, thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's program. They Called Us Girls, Stories of Female Ambition from Suffrage to Mad Men. And author Kathleen Stone is with us to deliver a presentation based on her aforementioned book, They Called Us Girls. In mid-20th-century America, women faced a paradox. Thanks to their efforts, World War II production had been robust, and in the peace that followed, more women worked outside the home than ever before, even dominating in some professions. Yet the culture, from politicians to corporations to television shows, portrayed the ideal woman as a housewife. Many women happily assumed that role, but a small segment bucked the tide, women who wanted to use their talents differently in jobs that had always been reserved for men. So author Kathleen Stone will introduce us to 7 of these unconventional women in insightful, personalized portraits that span a half a century. Kathleen weaves stories of female ambition, uncovering the families, teachers, mentors, and historical events that led to unexpected paths. What inspired these women, and what can they teach women and girls today? And so Kathleen Stone knows something about female ambition. As a lawyer, she was a law clerk to a federal judge, a litigation partner in a law firm, and a senior counsel at a financial institution. She's also taught seminars on American law in 6 foreign countries, including as a Fulbright senior specialist. Kathleen's work has been published in the Plowshares, Arts Fuse, the LA Review of Books, Timberline Review, and the Writer's Chronicle. She holds graduate degrees from the Boston University School of Law and the Bennington Writing Seminars. So all 65 of us or so, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Kathleen for joining us here tonight. And Kathleen, the floor is yours. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert. It's a delight to be with all of you tonight. And thank you also to the library staff at the other libraries who are part of this consortium. What I'd like to do is give you an overview of the book, how I conceived it, and also introduce you to the women that I write about and give you some historical context for them. And then I'd like to open it up to a conversation. Hear what your questions are and hear your comments about women's history and what you think the future holds for women's progress. So They Called Us Girls really fits into 2 categories, women's history and biography. It's a collection of biographical portraits of 7 extraordinary women. They were extraordinary because they had successful professional careers in an era when women were expected to stay home. What this really is a look at women of my mother's generation. My mother was born in 1922, and the women in the book were born in that general time period, maybe 10 years before or 10 years after she was. When I was young, my mother was a stay-at-home mom. She had a paid employment outside the home before I was born. She worked for IBM, but when I was born, she became a stay-at-home mom and raised 3 kids. And almost all of the women in our neighborhood were similar. And this was the 1950s and the early 1960s. I'm dating myself, I realize, but that was the time. However, I knew that a few women somewhere, I didn't know who they were, but I knew that somewhere women existed who did work outside the home, who were different from my mother and from the other women I saw around me. And I knew that because my father had gone to law school, and I used to look at the pictures in my father's law school yearbook. And the vast majority of the students pictured were men, but there were a few women. And I was absolutely intrigued as a young girl by these women. You know, who were they? How could they do something so different from what I saw around me? So I had that curiosity planted in me when I was quite young. The curiosity never entirely went away, but of course it did recede. You know, it sort of slipped into the background and I went about my own life. I became a lawyer, I became a wife and a mother. But sometime, 20 plus years into my legal career, I felt that curiosity bubbling up in me again. And I guess I was in a time period when I was reflective about my own life. And I began wondering again more actively about women of my mother's generation who had done what I thought was extraordinary things by becoming professional workers outside of the home. And I realized the only way to find out what made these women tick and what made them defy those expectations was to go talk to them myself. So all the women that you'll read about in the book, I interviewed each one personally. And really the interviews are at the heart of the book. So I would like to introduce you to the 7 women I write about in the book with a slideshow. And you'll see their pictures, and I'll tell you just a little bit about them. So the first chapter is devoted to Dalila Ipcar. She was an artist and an author of more than 30 children's books.
So Kathleen, can you hear me, Kathleen?
Yes.
Yeah, so we can actually see the slides. So
I'm sorry, I forgot to share screen.
that's okay.
I'm so sorry. Is this better
Perfect.
now? Okay.
Exactly.
Thank you for being on top of this. So Dalila Ipcar gets the first chapter in the book. She was an artist and an author of something like more than 30 children's books. And here she is in her studio. And you can get an idea of the vibrant colors that she used in her work. And you can also get an idea that she often pictured animals. That was really her passion, was to depict animals in her paintings. And often also in her books. Often they were about animals. She grew up in Greenwich Village. Both of her parents were artists, both prominent members of the early modern period. Her mother was Marguerite Thompson Zorak. Her father was William Zorak. But when she was 18, she married Adolf Ipcar, a man who was about, I think, 17 years older than she was. They quit their jobs in New York and moved to Maine, where they had a small farm and raised dairy cows on the Georgetown Peninsula south of Bath, Maine. She very much carved out her own career path in Maine. It was not really a big artist. It wasn't a great locale for artists at that time. And she moved there in the middle of the Depression. I first learned of Dalila Ipcar from this book, Lobsterman, which was published in 1962. And somebody gave it as a gift to my younger brother. And I heard my parents reading it to him. And I became captivated by the story. It's about a young boy in Maine who goes out lobstering with his father for a day. But what really got me was her depiction of the Maine seacoast. My grandparents lived in Maine, and I knew the Maine coast because we spent summers there. And I really was impressed with how she depicted the landscape that I was familiar with from my own life. And when I had my own son, of course, many years later, I bought the book again and read it to him. And then when I learned that Dalila was still alive and well and living in Maine, at the time I was working on this book, I approached her about doing an interview, and she immediately invited me to her house, and I met her there and interviewed her, and she gets the first chapter. This is Muriel Pettione. She was a physician based in Harlem, but this picture was taken when she was about 3 years old and living in Trinidad. Her family was from Trinidad, But her father was a journalist, and he was writing articles advocating for independence. It was still a British colony at the time. And he was basically kicked out of the country. So the family emigrated to the United States, and her father came with a plan. His plan was to become a doctor, which he did. He went to medical school, became a doctor, became prominent in the Harlem community. He called medicine a liberating profession, and it was liberating for him because he had a professional perch where he could do his work, but he could also become a community activist and political activist, which he did, and be insulated from what had happened in Trinidad. He wasn't going to be kicked out of the country, and he was going to get some respect because of his professional perch. Muriel very much followed in his footsteps. She also went to medical school and became a real advocate for the Harlem community, both politically and socially. And she was very active at the Harlem Hospital, for instance, and many other activities as well. But she really followed her father's footsteps. She was the only woman in her medical school class. She graduated from medical school in 1937 from Howard University. And here she is when she was interning at Harlem Hospital. And when she was there, starting in 1937, the hospital had only fairly recently begun hiring its very first Black doctors. So she was pretty much in the vanguard in that respect as well. This is Cordelia Hood. Cordelia was an intelligence analyst. She began her career with OSS during World War II. She had majored in German in college and graduated in 1936 from Reed College. She and a college friend went to France, where they lived with a family and studied the French language. But after about a year in France, she decided to move on, and she traveled through Italy and then into Germany, where she was joined by her brother and sister. And the three siblings went to Munich, where they ran into Nazis patrolling the streets. They wanted no part of that. Then they moved on to Austria, and they happened to be in Vienna when the Anschluss occurred, and Austria became a Nazified country. That was an indelible experience for her, as you can well imagine. So when the United States entered the war in 1941, she looked for war-related work, and she worked at a couple of different agencies, but eventually got into OSS and went to London and then Bern, Switzerland, which was OSS European headquarters. So she worked for OSS during the war and then for CIA after the war, where she became a Soviet specialist. I knew her personally. She was a friend of my husband's family, and this is how I remember her. This is just how she looked when I knew her as an older woman. And here she is as a younger woman. Martha Lipow was also a physician. She grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, went to medical school there, and then after medical school, she worked at what was called the virus lab in Cleveland. The virus lab was studying the polio virus at the time, and also doing work that supplemented the development of the Salk vaccine for polio. And when she was on the ward, she treated many polio patients. And here she is reading a book, I guess it's a comic book, to a young girl who is confined to an iron lung. Unfortunately, the words on the left side of the picture are cut off, but there's a paper sign. And what the entire sign said was, the polio vaccine works. And this was just at the time the Salk vaccine was declared successful. But unfortunately, it was too late for this little girl. And here's Martha a little bit later in life with her husband, also a doctor. This is Mildred Dresselhaus. She is there behind the desk, although it's hard to see. Mildred was a scientist and the first woman to be a full tenured professor at MIT. I didn't take this picture, but this is just how her office looked when I went to interview her. We had to move papers and books off the chairs in order to sit down and talk. Mildred started experimenting with the material carbon, the thing that we have in our pencils. But she discovered that it had a lot more properties than being put into pencils. And it really became the basis for the emerging technology of nanotechnology. And she won many awards for her work and for her discoveries. And this picture gives you an idea of at least one of her awards. The girl in this picture is Frida Garcia. She was about 8 years old, and this is a passport picture issued by the government of the Dominican Republic. And she and her mother and her brother traveled to the United States using this passport. They were immigrants. She grew up in New York City in a mostly Spanish-speaking neighborhood, but she was the first one in her family to learn English. And she became the translator for her family. Her mother never did learn English. In 1960, she moved to Boston, where she became the executive director of a large social service agency in Boston, and also a prominent member of the Boston nonprofit community. She served on many boards, and she had what I would call cultural competence. She was perfectly comfortable crossing cultural and ethnic boundaries between and among the Hispanic community, the African-American community, and the white community. And because of that skill, she became a political advisor to a number of Massachusetts governors and Boston mayors. And here she is with Governor Dukakis. This picture was probably taken sometime in the 1980s. And the last woman in the book is Ria Zobel. She was the first woman to become a federal judge in Massachusetts. That happened in 1979. She was appointed by President Jimmy Carter. Judge Zobel was born and grew up in Germany, and she lived in Germany during World War II. Her family managed to survive the war there, even though her mother was Jewish, because her mother managed to get falsified papers that erased her Jewishness. After the war, in the summer after 1945, the Americans turned over the eastern part of the country to the Soviets, and that's where she lived. And Soviet soldiers came away and took away both of her parents. So at age 13, Ria and her younger brother were left as orphans, essentially. She had an uncle in the United States. She had two uncles in the United States. One came to Germany to find out what had happened to the family. He managed to get Ria and her brother out of the eastern sector and into the western sector of Germany, and then onto a ship. And they were on one of the first UN ships that brought refugee children to the United States. She sailed into New York Harbor in January of 1947. She lived with her uncle and aunt in New York. She eventually went to Radcliffe College and Harvard Law School, graduating from Harvard Law School in 1956. She became a law clerk to a federal judge, which is a job she had for about 10 years. Then she became the first female partner at Goodwin Procter law firm in Boston. And then in 1978, Jimmy Carter nominated her for the federal bench. And here she is just a few years ago being honored at a Federal Bar Association event. So Those are the 7 women who I write about in my book. They all shared a time period. They all lived through the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement. But what was really interesting to me was how their individual lives intersected with those external events. And for each one, it was a unique combination of personal circumstance and historic events, and how it affected or didn't affect each one of them. What I'd like to do now is pick up with Ria Zobel, the last woman you just saw, and read a little bit from the chapter about her. It's the last chapter in the book. It gives a little bit of the historical context in which she and the other women lived, and also raises some questions about ambition and what that really means in this context. So here we are in the last chapter of the book. The last interview I conducted for this book was with Ria Zobel, a judge on the United States District Court in Boston. I knew who she was before we met. 10 years earlier, I had litigated a case in her courtroom. Opposing counsel and I argued several legal motions and had a series of conferences with the judge. I saw enough of her on the bench to know she was confident and businesslike. I also knew from my own clerkship with a federal judge that a judge who is businesslike in the courtroom may show a different side in private. So it was with Judge Zobel. In chambers, she was relaxed and funny. She wore black slacks, a white blouse, and a boldly patterned red jacket that would be easy to slip off if she had to don the black robe for an emergency hearing. Before we met, I tried to gather background information, but surprisingly little was available. Basic facts were on the court website: date of birth, schools attended, date sworn into the court. Also, I knew who her ex-husband was. I once had a case before him, a judge on the Massachusetts Superior Court. But more in-depth facts were sparse. It seemed she had not given many interviews, and those she had produced generalities for the most part. And by the way, I had no idea about her losing her parents right after World War II. That was news to me during the interview. Obviously, I wanted to interview a lawyer. Imagining the lives of women lawyers had started me on this quest in the first place. I had tried but failed to track down the women in my father's yearbook. Probably some had changed their names with marriage, and some had retired or died by the time I looked for them. I asked, but the Yale Alumni Office was unable to help. I was lucky that a friend who was once Judge Zobel's law clerk was willing to make an email introduction. I took it from there, and in my first phone call with the judge, she signaled her resistance to my idea. I never was ambitious, she said. This confounded me. As a federal judge, she occupied a top echelon of the profession. No one just walks into that job. She had to have had oomph of some kind. But there I was, primed for the final interview in my exploration of female ambition, and she was rejecting the paradigm. Virginia Woolf once wrote an essay that serves as a warning to biographers. In the desire to create a significant life story, she wrote, biographers attach meaning to their subjects' actions and words that the subjects themselves never conceived. Was I wrong to think Judge Zobel's life involved ambition when she said it didn't? Was I dragging along a preconceived notion that did not fit? I kept Virginia Woolf in mind, but I plunged ahead, knowing at the least that Ria Zobel was exceptional. She had to be exceptional because the legal field was so resistant to change. For more than a century, women angled for the right to represent clients. Often, when they did become members of the bar, they were kept out of the courtroom. Compared to medicine, law was far more restrictive. It did not start out that way. In the middle of the 19th century, the first women doctors and first women lawyers started working at about the same time. But after the firsts in those professions, things took a turn. In 1870, for example, Myra Bradwell passed the qualifying exam in Illinois. But when she applied to become a member of the bar, the state turned her down because she was married. She nevertheless persisted and took her case to the U.S. Supreme Court. There she lost again, and Justice Joseph Bradley took it upon himself to explain that no woman should have a career of any sort because that was the divine order. Here is an excerpt from his concurring opinion. The natural and proper timidity and delicacy which belongs to the female sex evidently unfits it for many of the occupations of civil life. The constitution of the family organization, which is founded in the divine ordinance, as well as in the nature of things, indicates the domestic sphere as that which properly belongs to the domain and functions of womanhood. The harmony, not to say identity, of interests and views which belong or should belong to the family institution is repugnant to the idea of a woman adopting a distinct and independent career from that of her husband. The paramount destiny and mission of woman are to fulfill the noble and benign offices of wife and mother. This is the law of the Creator. Thus spoke the U.S. Supreme Court. So that opinion was from 1873. But paradoxically, at the same time, there was an upward trend of women in higher education. And there was really an upward trajectory from about 1880 to 1920 of more and more women getting bachelor's degrees and graduate degrees. And that led many of them, or certainly some of them, into professional careers. At the same time, women, or some women anyway, were advocating for suffrage. It was sort of an optimistic, expansive period where women thought that opportunities would open for them. And of course it did in a way. In 1920, the 19th Amendment passed, women could vote. But not too long after that, women's progress both in education and in professional careers slowed and then stopped. And for about 50 years, from 1920 to 1970, women in professions were pretty much at a plateau. Now, this was a period when sex discrimination was perfectly legal. And even in instances when there wasn't overt sex discrimination, there was generally a very narrow conception of what women could and should do. Some women were obviously intelligent, well-educated, proficient in their work, but they were regarded as not quite up to having professional jobs. Women were thought to be not logical, not authoritative enough, too emotional to have the kind of white-collar professional jobs in certain male-dominated fields. I have one more slideshow that I'd like to show you. It's very short, where the numbers will illustrate what I've just said about the historical context in which prevailed from between 1880 and really 1970. So this is a timeline from 1890 to 1990, and I put in pictures to show sort of the progression of women's fashion. In 1890, women were wearing high-necked, long dresses. By 1970, we were all wearing mini skirts, and in 1990, women were wearing professional garb. And by the way, that's me in the 1970 picture with long hair and a mini skirt. So this shows you educational trends. The blue line is bachelor's degrees, and you can see that there was an upward trend, which pretty much followed master's degrees as well, which is the orange line. When there was a real high point around 1930, and then down to 1950, things really slowed down and really descended. Fewer women were, as a percentage, in higher education. The PhD line is the gray line, and the yellow line is what's called a first professional degree, and that is medicine, law, dentistry, those kinds of professions. And those degrees were really not even tracked for many decades, at least in the US Census. And it was really there was a little bit of a blip in 1950, but it really began, the real ascendancy was from 1970 and thereafter. So that gives you an idea of, and all the women in my book came of age in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s when there was the downward trend. But these women, 6 out of the 7 had college degrees, and 5 out of the 7 had graduate degrees. So they went ahead with their education, even when overall fewer women were going into higher ed. And this slide gives you an idea of medicine, law, and science as a careers. In 1970, these were the numbers: 8% in medicine, 4% in law, and 7% in science. 20 years later, in 1990, 17% in medicine, 20% in law, and 23% in science. So again, that indicates that the women in my book came of age really when the numbers were extremely low. They were in a tiny minority of women doing the kinds of jobs that they were doing. And of course, because they were so unusual and doing something that was really going against the grain, that is, of course, exactly why I wanted to interview them for the book. And just to circle back on a couple of the women whose pictures you've already seen, again, Muriel Pettioni was the only woman in her medical school class in 1937. Mildred Dresselhaus, the scientist who was the professor at MIT, she did her PhD work at the University of Chicago. Well, I think it was under 5% of women were getting PhDs in physics at the time. And her advisor told her that women didn't even belong in the program. Of course, she ignored him and kept on. And Cordelia Hood, the intelligence analyst for OSS and CIA, she was fluent in a couple of languages. She had traveled in Europe before the war. She knew exactly the kind of threat the Nazis posed. But when she applied to go to OSS for a job, the first thing they did was send her to typing school. And she barely passed, but she did pass enough to have a job. So I'll say a word about the title of the book. The title is They Called Us Girls. And that is really a quote from something that Ria Zobel told me. She graduated from Harvard Law School in 1956, and that was one of the first classes to have any women at all. It was just before Ruth Bader Ginsburg was at Harvard Law School. When she graduated, she looked for a job with a law firm, but as she told me, law firms were not hiring women. And as she also said, they didn't call us women, they called us girls. So when I was thinking about a title for the book, her quote seemed to me to be the perfect way to crystallize not only her experience, but the experience of so many women in that time period. So that became the title. The subtitle, Stories of Female Ambition from Suffrage to Mad Men, really, I used it to pack in a lot of information. The reference from Suffrage to Mad Men really refers to the 50-year period from 1920 to 1970. In fact, Frida Garcia, who was the executive director of the Social Service Agency in Boston, she's the one who really brought Mad Men to mind for me. Before she had gotten her degree in social work, she was a secretary on Madison Avenue. And she said when she saw the TV show Mad Men, she thought, oh, that is just what it was like. All the men would go, and a few women, but mostly men, dominated Madison Avenue, and they would go out for their 2 or 3 martini lunch. And so that all of the, the stereotypes, she said, that they're shown on the TV show, she said, were very real to her. I also use the phrase stories of female ambition in the subtitle. And just a note about ambition, I referred to it in the excerpt from the chapter that I read. But if you look at the dictionary, ambition is defined as a drive to achieve fame or fortune. That's not what these women were about. None of them became really famous. Some of them were very well known within their fields, but they were not nationally famous. Their names weren't up in lights. And that was intentional on my part. I didn't want 1 or 2 famous women to sort of skew things. And I thought famous women have already had things written about them. I wanted to write about those who were really more like the rest of us, more like me and probably you. But I thought they were nonetheless ambitious, not for fame or fortune, but they were ambitious to use their talents outside the home in a way that made them personally feel fulfilled in their work. But also, I think in every instance, they all used their work in a way to reach out to other people, either through medicine, obviously taking care of patients, in law, through the legal system. As a judge, of course, you're affecting other people's lives. As a social worker and director of a social service agency, of course, you're attempting to help other people. And even Daliv Ipkar, the artist and children's book author, she wrote so many books that touched so many children's lives and families' lives, that she also had an impact on others. So these women had ambition, but of their own definition, not the standard dictionary definition. So I'd love to take your questions, and Robert's going to help me by reading your questions and comments. And I'd love to hear what you think and what your questions are.
So Kathleen, wonderful job as expected. Folks, at this time, feel free to start putting questions in the Q&A and comments in the chat. Kathleen, we already have 7 questions for you. Joyce wants to know, how did you narrow down your book to just these 7 women?
Great question. And I did interview more than these 7. I probably interviewed a dozen women. My criteria were age. I wanted them born before 1935, and they had to have had a successful career in a white-collar profession. And by saying that, I don't mean to suggest that other women don't contribute to our society in other ways, but and in fact, if I do another book, it's going to be on women in the trades, not white-collar professions. But because that was related to what I thought about when I was a young girl myself, that was my criteria. These women I selected because they had particularly interesting lives. Every one of them faced challenges, recovered from the challenges, and just interesting things happened to them, either through their work or through circumstance. So in a couple of cases, it was hard to eliminate other women, but I thought these were the most interesting stories. And also these women, I interviewed everyone when they were in their 80s and 90s. And I was relying on their oral histories for my primary research. And I wanted to be sure that they were able to tell a good story. One woman who I would have loved to have had in the book, I thought her memory wasn't really strong enough. I wasn't really getting the facts from her that I needed. So unfortunately, a few people had to fall by the wayside because of that.
And I think your answer to that question also answered Catherine's question. So Jean asks, was there a common thread, common characteristics, or common background in these women's childhoods that could be identified that may have contributed to their desire to seek advanced education?
Yes, I think so. And in my primary answer to that question is something that sounds almost predictable, but I think it's also profound, which is the importance of family. I know that sort of sounds like a Hallmark card or something, but it was all of them, one way or another, had family who allowed them to see themselves as getting an education and working in an interesting and challenging career. And I think Dr. Muriel Pettioni said it best. She said to me, every child, and she worked in the school systems in Harlem as a physician. So she saw a lot of children, and she was an advocate for those kids. But what she said to me was that every child needs someone to say they can do something great in their lives. And if it's their parents who say that to them, they're lucky. And most of these women had parents who did say that to them. And in fact, Muriel Pettioni's father said to her, "You are going to go to college. I went to college, your grandfather went to college, and you will go to college." And he said that to both his daughters and to his son. He, as Muriel said, he was equal opportunity in terms of boys and girls in the family. One woman I can think of didn't have parents who were really keyed into the educational system. That Mildred Dresselhaus's parents were recent immigrants to the United States. Her father never held down a paying job. Her mother did unskilled manual labor. They didn't know anyone who had gone to college other than the kids' teachers, so that they were not really well positioned to help their children channel their aspirations into higher ed. But her father did introduce Muriel and her brother to Greenwich House, which was a settlement house in Lower Manhattan, which had a music school. And Muriel learned to play violin there. But more importantly, the staff at the music school observed that she was not only an aspiring violinist, but very, very bright. And they guided her. They would ask her to do things like go to the movies and see a movie and then write a review of it for the internal settlement house newsletter. And then when it was time for her to think about high school, they guided her towards a competitive exam school in New York City. And that, as she told me, was really the first real step for her, was to get into a good high school, which then led to college and then further graduate degrees. So in answer to your question, I think families was always important, although it took different forms for different girls. The other theme, and this was really surprising to me, was immigration. I did not think about immigration status for any of them when I was choosing women at all. It was really when I was pulling together the threads and writing the epilogue for the book that it occurred to me that 6 out of the 7 women were either immigrants themselves or the daughters of immigrants. And the 7th woman, Cordelia Hood, was not an immigrant, but her family had, she was descended from Daniel Boone, so she had this pioneer mentality. So the immigration theme I found very striking. In fact, so striking that when Michelle Wu was elected mayor of Boston, and I learned that and she's the daughter of immigrants, and I learned that her campaign manager was a 25-year-old woman who was also the daughter of immigrants, I ended up writing an article that was published in Ms. Magazine about how many daughters of immigrants or immigrants have have a real will to succeed and get higher ed. So I guess I would say family and immigration status were the two themes that I extracted from my research.
Teresa asks, what was the most surprising thing you learned while researching and writing this book?
Well, the immigration thing that I just mentioned was
Right.
surprising to me.
Yeah.
And I guess I alluded to something else, which was the way external events either did or didn't affect different lives. For Cordelia Hood, her experience of having been in Austria when it became Nazified, seeing the Nazis, and then the United States entering the war was really a galvanizing event. She decided she would she would find some kind of government related job and work for the US to help it win the war. So for her, that was really important. For Dalib Ibkar, the artist, she was living in rural Maine. She was an artist. She had young children, and her husband was much older, too old for the military. And they had very minimal disruption to their lives as a result. So I thought that was also interesting, that even an event as singular as World War II could have such different effects on different people's lives.
Lois writes, growing up, my next door neighbor was a certified teacher, but she was forced to quit once she got married.
Yep.
And Diane mentions it wasn't until 1965 when the first woman graduated from Harvard Medical School. That still makes my blood boil. Diane also notes that she would love for you to write another book. Rosamond asks, how long did it take you to write and publish your book?
More than a decade, I would say. I had, it's a process. I had to find the women. I had to interview them. I did a lot of supplemental research. And I wasn't in the beginning doing it full time. I was still practicing law. I also interrupted some of the book work to go back to graduate school. I went back to Bennington and got an MFA in literature and creative writing because I wanted to learn to write not like a lawyer, and to write in a way that people would actually want to read the book. So it took me probably more than 10 years from beginning to end.
Similar questions that I'm going to combine. An anonymous attendee writes, did these women have families? And Angelo writes, did these women discuss how they balanced their work with their personal family life, especially if they had children?
Great questions, both of them. Yes, most of them had children. I think 5 out of the 7 had children. Mildred Dresselhaus, the MIT professor, had 4 kids. And Martha Lipau, the doctor from Cleveland, had 3 children. A couple of the others had 1, and 2 of them had no children at all. And I did talk to them about how they managed to have their careers and also their families. And every one of them, except for Dalib Ibkar, the artist, had outside help.
And Jean asks, was Rhea Zobel married to Judge Zobel, who presided over the Louise Woodward case? It's a kind of an unusual last name.
It is the same one.
Oh, interesting.
They were, I think, divorced by that time of that Woodward case. But yeah, that was.
All right. Well, we've exhausted I think we had 10 questions there. I don't see any additional questions or comments in the chat. Folks, let Kathleen know in the chat if you enjoyed tonight's presentation. And while folks do that, Kathleen, do you have any last words for the audience?
I was just going to say 2 more things. One was to just circle back to the question about women and having families and balancing that with their careers. They all talked about their outside help, and I mentioned them in the chapters about each woman where there was outside help, because they couldn't have had their careers without either helpful husbands or outside help. And I feel the same way about my career, both having a helpful husband and a terrific nanny who helped with after-school care for my son. Couldn't have done it without women like that. The only other thing I was going to add is thank you all for coming. And if you read the book, I'd love it, and my publisher would really love it, if you would post a review on Amazon. You do not need to buy any books from Amazon. You can go to your local bookstore or any other source, or go to your library and read the book. But if you could post a review on Amazon, my publisher would appreciate it. So thank you.
Yeah, Kathleen, thank you very much. I can say that your book is on order with the Tewksbury Library. It'll be on the shelf very soon. We did have a last minute question. We'll go to the question, then I'm going to read the comments. Jonathan asks, what was your biggest challenge in getting your book published? Was it easy?
It wasn't easy, but I got lucky. I was querying agents, and that wasn't going well. And then I started to query small independent presses, and fairly early on, I got an email from Kinrun Press saying which specializes in either historical fiction or memoir or biography. And I got an email from them saying they would like to publish my book. I was just over the moon that finally this project was going to see the light of day and it was going to get published. So it was a long process, but I just got lucky with a small independent press.
Let's read some comments real quick and then we'll wrap up. Jean says, great presentation, very informative. Trish says, this was excellent. Thank you so much. Too bad we are still called girls too often. Rosamond says, great program. Thank you. Teresa says, thank you for introducing us to these amazing women, and I can't wait to read your book. Joyce says, wonderful presentation. Diane says, thank you for an inspiring evening. I can't wait to read your book. Jody says, fascinating talk. Looking forward to reading your book. Congratulations on writing such a pertinent book. Donna says, so interesting. Now to get my hands on your book. Thank you. Maddie says, very insightful. I enjoyed this program and will read your book. Linda says, I really enjoyed this and I'm looking forward to reading your book. I'm seeing a trend here. Let's see. Angela says, I really enjoyed your presentation. Diane says, extremely insightful and intriguing about the common themes and differences and interesting on how we can take this knowledge, historical and the evolution of these lives to share with others. Jean says, thank you so much for your presentation. Jonathan says, thank you. Great job. So we're going to wrap it there. Kathleen, thank you so much. Folks, look for an email from me tomorrow with a link to a feedback survey. Let us know what you thought of tonight's event, a link to tonight's recording. Please share it with anyone who wasn't able to be here tonight, and also some information about some other really great upcoming virtual author events. I again want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library. I want to thank the handful of libraries that partnered with us tonight, including Ashland, Andover, Clinton, North Andover, and Groton. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening. Thanks again, Kathleen.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.